Today's reading comes from Luke chapter 12. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And Jesus said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And the man thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain, my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." The Diag here at U of M didn't always have trees. A brand new professor named Andrew White arrived in 1857, about 20 years after the university started operating in Ann Arbor, saw a wretched field with muddy paths connecting what were then the 4 university buildings, and asked why there were no trees. People had tried, apparently, but blamed the soil, and they'd given up. Professor White said that must be impossible, since there were plenty of trees just outside of that area and forest beyond the village of Ann Arbor. Ultimately, Professor White rounded up students to help him water and tend the trees they planted, and the Diag became the shady park where students now read, gather, put up hammocks, and eat ice cream. It has been said, "Blessed are those who plant trees under which they will never sit." It's a proverb attributed to India, but we don't really know where it comes from. In any case, the idea itself is pervasive across cultures, because planting a sapling requires patience. If the sapling makes it past the phase where it just looks like a little stick, it's particularly susceptible to wind and heat and the elements. 20 years later, you might have a decent looking tree if all goes well. It's a risk that may or may not pan out, and when you plant a tree, you know you're entrusting its future care to someone else, because any sapling planted now will potentially outlive all of us. Planting a sapling and putting in the care required for that baby tree to survive means knowing you won't probably ever see it in its full glory. But you do know what it's going to look like eventually, more or less. There's a vision of the future there, and ultimately it's selfless and must be so, because you are never going to see that vision realized. The rich man in today's gospel isn't planting trees. He's building barns. If you notice, everything in his own narrative is about himself. He says "I" 6 times and manages to have a conversation with his own soul in just 2 short sentences. He is the definition of self-involved, and he is only going to look out for number 1. We have to remember that in Jesus' time, food scarcity was both common and publicly known. So the idea that a person would look at a good harvest and choose to store a massive amount, keeping it from others and allowing it potentially to rot rather than sustain his hungry neighbors, was downright sinful. Man's choice to hoard is ungodly, and there's really no nice way to put it. And this man had lots of choices. He could have thrown a party and everyone could have gone away well fed. He could have divided the grain into various sacks and delivered them to nearby communities where people had not been so fortunate. He could have told people for miles around to come and help themselves to his extra grain. But instead of using his gifts well, he remained inward focused, keeping his attention on himself. And it turns out that, like everyone else, he can't take it with him. He's not that special. Stewardship is about so much more than the duty of giving money or even of just sharing resources. Consider the resources that you have: time, money, expertise, and skill. How do you think about them, and how are you using them? How could you think about them from a posture of generosity and abundance and use them even better in service to your community? How could those gifts be a bridge for others, a way to create and maintain authentic connection and community? This gospel lesson is both well known and politely ignored because it asks so much of us. Critiquing and going against our culture's impulse to lift up independence, self-sufficiency, and conspicuous consumption feels like a monumental task, because it is. But we know that beyond having enough, spending on material possessions doesn't do a whole lot for happiness. In the same way, the dopamine hit you get from having your post liked doesn't last. Where are we storing up our treasures? How are we hoarding the gifts God has given us, or even misusing them? Jesus calls us to look outward, just as God chooses to continue to look at us and love us. We are called to share, called to be interdependent, called to live lives that are fully committed to each other's well-being. That means operating from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. The myth of self-care falls into that culturally individualistic trap too, because if self-care is up to me, if it's defined by spending my resources on myself rather than the kind of communal care and mutual responsibility Jesus is calling us to, it winds up being empty. A walk in the woods with my family, or quality snuggle time on the couch with my kids, or time spent reading a book, or time spent marveling at the majesty of nature, these things all remind me of my connection to God and God's creation. They ground me. They remind me that I'm not separate, that I'm not alone, and that I am not God. But a culture of mutual care doesn't necessarily result in more money being spent, and so self-care is more easily characterized by the ubiquitous mani-pedi, which is, after all, transactional. The good news is that we are not ever called to depend solely on ourselves for our daily bread. We are reminded rather that all we have belongs to God, that the things that connect us to one another are essential pieces of who we are. There's a reason why we don't commune ourselves or baptize ourselves. We are reminded that none of us are actually worthy on our own, that we're not actually independent, that all we have, we receive from one who loves us into abundance. Jesus invites us to come together and share together because we belong to each other. Generosity is not an inherent quality, but rather a skill that's cultivated over time. How can you be generous today with the resources God has given you? Today, whether you think you have a lot or a little, go out remembering all you have to offer to a world in need, even if it's just a smile. And all you have to receive from the generosity of those around you. You may not ever see the full impact of your generosity, but it's no different from planting trees, knowing that others will witness their full beauty.